Good morning and welcome to everyone to our fourth City Leaders Dialogue, where we're focused on the net zero road to COP26 and beyond. It'll be my pleasure in a moment to introduce our very distinguished guest, the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees. The way that this seminar series works is that we try to tackle the issues post-pandemic, but climate change focused, where we're looking forward to and anticipating the COP meeting in Glasgow in November, and we're finding out what city leaders around the world are doing to get their cities and their citizens ready for the adjustments that we all need to make. We've already met the Mayor of Melbourne, the Mayor of Helsinki, and the leader of Manchester, and today it's our great honour to have the Mayor of Bristol with us. The format for the event will be a 40-minute interview between myself and the Mayor, and then there will be 15 minutes of Q&A with you, our audience. And I invite you now to work out where the Q&A button is and to start preparing your questions if you would. Now, it's now my honour to welcome our esteemed guest, Marvin Rees, the Mayor of Bristol. Many of you know that Marvin was first elected in May 2016 and then re-elected in May 2021. He's a Yale World Fellow and graduate of Operation Black Vote, and he's worked and studied in both the UK and the USA. During his first term as Mayor of Bristol, he's overseen the building of almost 7,000 homes. He's founded a city-owned housing company, and he's embarked on the largest council house building scheme for over 35 years. With an ambition to make Bristol more sustainable, more inclusive and fairer, he's developed the One City Plan for Bristol and is leading the city's response to both the climate emergency and the wider ecological issues, including the One City Climate Strategy. Marvin has brought forward major policies in the area of inequality, digitization, and in relation to place development and place leadership, including also the hosting of the Festival of the Future City, about which we'll hear more soon. So welcome to our City Leaders Dialogue and the road to COP26, Mayor of Bristol, Mayor Marvin Rees.
How are you? Thanks for the introduction, Greg.
Really good to see you, Marvin. I'm so delighted that you could spend some time with us this morning. Let's get straight into it, if we may, Marvin. And I want to begin really with the pandemic and simply to ask the obvious point that all cities around the world have been impacted by the pandemic, and you've led Bristol through this. How has Bristol proved to be resilient and agile? What's been revealed about Bristol's underlying strengths? And what do you think will be the lasting impact on the city that you're most focused on?
Well, there are two sources of the city's strength that have really come to the fore. The first is the ability of the key institutions in the city, what I call the anchor institutions, to come together and work together. And the second is the strength within human relationships within our community. So amongst those key institutions that are sovereign bodies, as it were, in the city, ourselves, the health service, the police, our universities, our colleges, our faith groups, those organizations, we now have a regular rhythm that started really quick off the back of the first, or actually before the first lockdown, where we meet once a week. Every Wednesday at 12:30, we have an hour-long call, a touch base. What's the single source of truth around what's going on with COVID? What are the challenges we see coming up, be they hunger, social isolation, the challenges facing schools? And then the question is, what can we do to work together to help us all meet those challenges? It may not be your top challenge. Students coming back to Bristol is not necessarily a policing challenge. But when the university bring that challenge, all those institutions begin to share expertise and mobilize. And interestingly, it was some of the experiences of one of our main adult social care providers that their approach and their experiences fed into what the universities did to manage the return of students. And then we found in our communities, one of the biggest sources of resilience was not just the services we provide, it was neighbours knowing neighbours and willing to knock on the door and say, do you need some shopping? And it actually speaks to the need to build community and human relationships into the future of city development. Big numbers on housing delivery is great, but building in the circumstances in which people can build human relationships are absolutely vital. And I think the long-lasting legacy, I mean, there are many, but a number of those that particularly concern me are that I think COVID will have ushered in an era in which the underlying drivers of inequality have been strengthened. The people who hit first and hardest by COVID will be the most vulnerable, and by definition, they'll be the least well placed to benefit from any economic social uptick when it comes. We have the legacy of the education, the disruption to education. We have a mental health legacy as well, as we know. And I'm also just a bit concerned that we keep our foot on the pedal and we don't have a premature artificial relief when we feel we've come through COVID. And we remember there were a number of crises facing us that are ongoing as well.
Marvin, thank you very much. I mean, these are very sober observations. And of course, you've rightly identified that in many ways, COVID has accelerated many of the factors of disadvantage and inequality. If we think about the opportunity to do things differently and better post-COVID, are there certain things that you've learned from the pandemic about what you'd like to be able to do differently as mayor of a great city?
Yeah, I certainly, it speaks to the need to have those underlying sources of resilience in place. I mean, COVID has been a test of resilience, first and foremost. Clearly our physical resilience, we've had the disproportionate vulnerability of poor people with underlying health conditions. Who would have thought we'd have tested our electoral system? My first term was 5 years rather than 4 because elections were postponed all across the country. So our political system was tested. Clearly our economic system, our welfare system. So it's a test of that. I think what it speaks to is if we are not resilient, not only is it tragedy in the lives of individuals and communities, but it actually costs us billions upon billions of pounds. So I think the lesson is invest in that resilience. Don't shortchange the investment in that resilience. And it speaks to, an article, actually a Bristol-based epidemiologist wrote about this not being a pandemic, but this better being understood, COVID, as a syndemic. And a syndemic is the interaction between a health challenge and your social conditions. And I find that really useful because if you want to be more resilient to syndemics, you need to provide good quality housing. You need people to get off to the best possible start in life, as Michael Marmot suggests, so that they don't have those underlying health conditions. You need to have good work terms and conditions in work so people can retain their employment with all that means for wider stability. So I think that's where it drives me. How do we make resilience, put resilience at the forefront of social policy going into the next decade at least?
It's a really fascinating issue, Marvin, and I think that we'll look to Bristol for lots of lessons here in the same way that we've looked at social resilience in cities like Medellin in the past, where they've been able to achieve a lot of progress. Turning this theme, though, towards climate change, we know that you've got big ambitions for Bristol. You've published the One City Climate Strategy, but we also know that your intention here is not, as it were, simply to try to decarbonize the city, but to use that process to achieve other things as well. So how is Bristol planning to meet its net zero commitments? But how can you do that in a way that has the effects you're talking about, better public health, better public services, greater resilience, reducing poverty and inequality? What's the link as you see it?
Well, we never talk about climate change without talking about inclusion and also now ecology. There was a very sobering challenge from an organization called Avon Wildlife Trust, actually said, you can solve climate, you can decarbonize and still lose nature, which in of extent itself will be an existential threat. So you have to be explicit about tackling the ecological crisis. So we put that, we just launched it last week, actually, our ecology action plan, which includes all sorts of commitments around net gain and biodiversity, building nature into our city's development. So we've always held the three together. But many of the things that we want to do around climate are actually good for inclusion and tackling poverty and inequality. It does mean, reducing the amount of energy people need to live by making homes more efficient, which tackles fuel poverty, which means that people aren't choosing between heating and eating. while also reducing the price the planet pays for us meeting our population's needs. As we look at the accessibility of food and food miles, we're now a food sustainable city, a gold standard sustainable city. But again, that ties together the location of food, access to food, and the price of food, as well. So we've always tried to tie those things together. But I also think it's really important for the environmental movement itself to understand that slogans such as "there's no jobs on a dead planet," I know they make sense in that sense, but they can be disrespectful, particularly if someone's existential threat is whether their child is being, groomed by a county lines gang. A mother whose first order concern is whether they're going to feed their children tonight or even tomorrow, it doesn't have the emotional and economic space to worry about existential threats in 10, 15 years time. So to me, keeping people with us, showing a level of respect for where people are, is absolutely essential into building the coalition we're going to need if we're going to introduce the scale of change at the pace at which we need to introduce it to meet our carbon targets.
And Marvin, I mean, you've already started, but more than anybody else I've heard in the last year and a half, you've been speaking very eloquently about this idea of a just transition. Not everybody in the webinar today will know what that means. What does a just transition really mean? And in particular, what does it mean in a city like Bristol?
Well, for me, it means not going into climate change and asking the most vulnerable, the poorest, the people who have benefited least from the economy and globalization to pay the disproportionately a higher price for that transition. Decarbonising isn't free; it costs money. In a very raw sense, we estimate that to decarbonise Bristol's economy costs about £10 billion. We've got to get that money from somewhere. It disrupts people's lives. There could be job losses as old industries, fossil fuel industry, for example, are, we disinvest in them and allow them to go away. And there can be dislocations as people don't necessarily have the skills to transition to the new economy. These are all prices to be paid. And it's not acceptable to ask those people who've benefited least to pay the highest price disproportionately. That's what I mean by a just transition. And I think we'll find that if we fail to follow the lines of a just transition, we could end up getting the reaction against our efforts to decarbonize the economy and support nature, as we did against globalization at the turn of the millennium, when people said, this isn't benefiting me, it's not helping me. So actually, let me just reject the whole thing. So we have to get this right, particularly with opportunistic, predatory, reactionary politicians who are roaming around looking for cheap popularity.
Marvin, thank you very much. You've laid that out brilliantly. And one of the things you've also been doing over the last year and a half, and you've teamed up with the leader of Glasgow, Councillor Susan Aitken, on this, is that you've been calling for much more effective investment in decarbonisation of cities. And this inspired us at CPC to develop with the core cities and the London councils something that's called the UK Climate Investment Commission, which you and I sit on together. As we gear up for COP26 in November and beyond, what do you think we should be trying to achieve in terms of enhanced investment in cities in the short term and in the longer term?
Well, on that piece of work that we're involved in, Greg, I think it's one of the most significant pieces of work available to cities as we go into COP. My fear of COP is that we leave COP with a bunch of pronouncements that are not attached to any plans that are set against costs, lines of finance, deadlines, and measurable outcomes, and I would say real places. And by that sense, there'll be abstract pronouncements with no real understanding of how we're going to make them real. So actually getting places like Bristol, Glasgow together with Manchester, Liverpool, talk to those city leaders. We got a whole bunch of systems where real people live. In Bristol's greater area, there's over 1.1 million people. Bristol is part of something called the Western Gateway, which stretches from Swansea to Swindon, Gloucester to North Somerset, 4.4 million people. It's a functional economic area. You can work with us to decarbonize the systems that underpin those functional economic areas. But that's my point. You need to talk to us. At the moment, we have not had a single approach from government to talk to the leaders of the major UK cities about working together on a plan that is costed and deliverable and set against a timeline for that journey of decarbonisation. So the work we've been doing is recognising the gap between the sums of money that we know are out there, whether they be in philanthropy or whether they be with investors looking for places to invest, and the cities and the networks of cities that want to work together to get stuff done but don't have access to that finance. Now, either there's a reconfiguration of existing financial vehicles that needs to happen, or we need to develop new financial vehicles. But that's the work we're doing. And if we can unlock that resource with the political leaders with the absolute commitment to get it done, I think we can really begin to to make progress. And bear in mind, I've just the Ban Ki-moon made the point, didn't he? Climate change will be won or lost in cities. Cities are 70 to 75% of carbon emissions. But bear in mind at the same point that cities offer an opportunity for a lower carbon footprint per life because of the density, the proximity of services and retail. We can live more efficiently in cities. So if we get them wrong, it can be a catastrophe, right? If we get it right, it could actually be a major part of our solution.
Marvin, thank you very much. And for those of us on the webinar who want to know more, the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission, if you just look it up, you'll see Marvin and Susan and myself and others very much involved in this. And we will be doing detailed financing work on 5 areas of decarbonisation in cities, from retrofitting housing to energy, transport and other systems. And I think, Marvin, we've identified already 205 billion of investment capability across the UK's major cities, and we'll be focusing on closing that gap. And thank you again, Marvin, to you and Susan for the inspiration to do this. Now, I want to come on to another part of decarbonisation, if we may, because I know that within Bristol, one of the things that you're focusing on is the decarbonisation of business and also the supply chain. And I think our visitors and our listeners will be very interested in what you're doing. One, about sort of what we might call the last mile logistics and the delivery system across the city. And secondly, the steps you're already taking to boost active travel, as it were, zero carbon travel, walking and cycling and everything else. So can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in those 2 areas?
Yeah, so our active travel took a real step change actually through COVID, when the money became, and again, this comes to the importance of resources, the money became available. So we widened pavements and introduced more cycle lanes across the city. There was an opportunity, there was a gap, and we took it. and actually many of those interventions have now stayed in place. But our approach to transport is to see active travel not something that stands alone, but as actually part of our whole transport system. Mm-hmm. So again, we see that as attached to the delivery of a mass transit system. Again, great, which costs money. But we can deliver a mass transit system which includes overground, underground option, which we don't have in the city as yet, which will make it more possible for people to live without cars. On active travel, also, we're trying to build that into the future of Bristol. So we're a city of just over 460,000 people at the moment. We have a housing crisis today. We have over 13,000 people on our housing waiting list. So we have to build homes. Bristol's going to grow to approximately 550,000 people by the middle of this century. So just like other cities, rapid urbanization, we have to build those homes. But then one of the points is that where we build those homes matters, the kind of homes and where we build them. So we're really focusing on higher density on brownfield sites in the middle of the city. Well, that has the benefit of making it possible to have a car because people are in close proximity to retail, entertainment, employment. Interestingly, quite often then people want homes, but they want them in an abstract. They don't want them where they live. So then you end up with a bit of pushback when you actually identify real plots of land. But nonetheless, we're beginning to build more densely. That also brings up a conversation around height, which also is a difficult city because the cityscape begins to change, and that causes people an issue. But again, it's in context. If you don't go up, then you're arguing to go out, and if you go out, you're building in greater dependency on energy and transport because people will have to travel. On business, we're really making headway on freight consolidation, as part of the city's future. Actually, it's part of managing our street scene as well. As Michael Bloomberg said, many of the things that make cities better to live in, more pleasant, cleaner, more efficient, are actually good for the climate too. I was just reading his book Climate of Hope, and this is the same with freight consolidation, taking big trucks out of the city during peak times, getting businesses to work together, using the retail centers that are really struggling and needing to transition, that rather than having lots of individual shops, they could be placed where freight is dropped off or mail order, and then people go to those single venues and pick up their mail order, their mail order items. So we've received the grant to set up a zero emission freight consolidation center within Bristol, and we're going to press forward with that, and we'd love to share the story as it comes forward.
Wonderful, Marvin. I mean, there's so much important in what you've just said, but in particular, this link between a more compact city where you've got better, more efficient uses of land with, medium density, high amenity living, coupled then with this better public transport system that also enables more people to enjoy cycling and walking because they can link up with it. In other words, there's a version of a city here that you're trying to create that allows you to grow but reduces car dependency at the same time. I think it's very, very interesting what you're saying. And then this last point about deliveries and consolidating the approach, making it more intelligent for how goods are delivered around the city. This seems absolutely essential because in the pandemic, we've noticed, of course, a big increase in people wanting to jump into their cars, but also a big increase in deliveries happening all over our city. So we salute you. Really interesting to hear that. Marvin, in the conversations we've had with the other city leaders, there's been an interesting debate about whether the city leaders are having to lead the citizens or whether the citizens are leading the city leaders themselves. And we've discovered from several of them that the city leaders feel that they're having to constantly run to catch up with the aspirations of their citizens to take carbon out, to reform the city, to create a city that is more livable and habitable. What kind of city is Bristol? Is it one where you're having to lead the majority, or are the majority leading you and setting the pace?
It's both, actually. And even I always struggle using the word I anyway. Yeah. I've got a whole team around me of experts, and I one of the points I often make is, what is good quality leadership? In many ways, the best quality leadership is comfortable with having people around them who are smarter than them. and that's what I've got. I got a whole bunch of people around me who are super smart. They know all about freight consolidation. They know all about how to get to climate change. They know about the finances of retrofitting. And my job in many ways is to make space for them and to say, yeah, get it done. Yeah. But my the relationship with the city is interesting because Bristol's seen as a progressive city, a forward thrusting city, hit the headlines with the hauling down of Colston statue and all that. It's a green city, with European Green Capital in 2015. But city like Bristol, like many cities, is a city of contradictions and contrasts. It's complicated. So we do have this brand of being progressive and all that, but we're also a city that Runnymede said we were the 7th worst city in the UK to be black in. We're one of the worst cities to be born poor in. We have a parliamentary constituency, Bristol West, that is amongst the highest percentage of school kids who go on to higher education. In Bristol South, we're amongst the lowest constituencies in the whole of England for children going on to higher education. We hold these inequalities together within the city. these map into the measures we need to undertake to make change. So one of my challenges to activists is often it's easy to carry a banner and it's easier to wear the T-shirt with the slogan on it. But now let's get down to the gritty question of where we're going to build the houses. All right. So, for example, the one I just referred to just now, we need to build more densely. We know that. That means a conversation around height. But when you go into a conversation around height, there can be a real backlash. Or when you begin to identify brownfield sites, there's one in Bristol. You can end up with the backlashes. And I think when we get into the actual trade-offs and recognizing that there are no perfect solutions and every option you take has a price, it gets more difficult to actually say. It just gets more difficult for people to go on that journey. And it was one of my constant bugbears actually of the quality of politics and journalism. And it speaks to the importance of good quality politics and journalism, that people are given the space to enter into the complexity of city leadership, that everything is a trade-off, nothing is clean, nothing is cost-free. Tackling climate change is going to mean things change. You're not just going to get it because you bought organic carrots, and hey, that was really nice, wasn't it? That's not the way it's going to happen. It's going to mean the shape of the city changes. And that's difficult for people sometimes.
Marvin, you're making a very big point here. So I'm just going to summarize it, if I may. You're saying that actually the process of decarbonisation only works if you're willing to change many other things in the city. Some of that is about densifying land use. Some of that is about tackling deeply embedded inequality. Some of that is about changing the way the skills systems works. It's about giving people completely different transport choices. So decarbonisation is about completely reinventing the city. And perhaps what you're saying is not everybody realises the scale and the scope of the change that's required to actually deliver it. Have I summarised that correctly?
Yeah. I mean, and the point you made there is one that we've been sharing, isn't it? That we right now at this moment in time, we need to reconceptualize, replan, and rebuild our cities, right? So that the very systems on which cities depend are decarbonized, support nature, and drive equality and inclusion. But that takes money to do that. But a failure our cities have grown up over time quite often without much design. There's been no big plan for Bristol. It's just developed. When we've needed houses, there's been a planning application. If it comes in line, someone's gone to take that land and build it. But there's been no grand plan. But we're at a time now where we cannot enter the future without a grand plan. And that does involve that whole reconfiguring of the way our cities function.
Marvin, thank you very much. Very, very clear. And for our listeners and viewers who haven't read the work, as well as reading the Bristol City plans, I'd encourage you to read the Coalition for Urban Transition's work on how to reconfigure cities to be zero carbon, but also to be fairer, cleaner, and much more livable at the same time. And I want to remind you that in a few minutes, I'll stop asking Marvin questions and it'll be your turn. So please start to put your questions into the Q&A if we may. Marvin, at the Connected Places Catapult, we're of course very, very interested in the positive role that technology might play in connecting people better with the physical, social and environmental aspects of the city. And you have a vision of Bristol as a connected city. Bristol already has a leading digital economy. What does all of this mean? How do you see Bristol's world-class digital economy contributing to your imperatives as a city leader?
Well, I'm really glad in your introduction there, Greg. Again, you mentioned the physical connectivity, isn't it? Because I see it with my own children when they come home and they want to play Fortnite. I still want them to be physically connected, not just talking to people digitally and having that artificial, but digital friendships. So we need that digital work to really be hand in hand with the need to keep people physically connected with real human relationships, really experiencing nature, really walking around our streets as part of living communities. So we really want to push on the the digital leadership Bristol has shown and experienced over the last couple of decades in particular, and is of huge importance to our economy and our business community. You think we have a hugely significant creative sector within Bristol. It's a remarkable fact that over a third of the world's natural history broadcasting comes through Bristol, which is incredible. Countries like Blue Planet, Tiny World, World at Night come through Bristol. Companies like BBC, Plimsoll, Icon, so amazing. And the digital connectivity really supports that industry, so we recognise that. But fundamentally, we're social animals, and we that has to be tied and not be the digital connection cannot be a substitute for real human relationships. So again, it comes back to that question, Greg, about how we build communities, how we think about our housing stock, how we think about employment that actually creates the conditions in which people can form genuine human relationships. We don't have the easy answer to that, but what we do have is the ambition to deliver that. And with anyone who comes and works here, they join us in trying to solve that challenge.
Thank you very much, Marvin. I mean, one of the things you've said consistently in the last half an hour is that it's about communities, it's about neighborliness. Some people call this social capital, but it's something to do with this sense of connecting with each other and belonging to each other and having responsibilities towards one another. And if you like, this kind of great warmth of kind of human connection that seems to be very important. And I visit Bristol pretty regularly, and you can actually feel it on the streets. So something very right is happening. And if you have any more insights about that, I'd love to know more, because it seems to me that this kind of social capital is the magical ingredient. Obviously, we're a bit off script here, but is that something that you deliberately try to foster?
Yeah, well, I come from a community development work background, Greg. My first job out of university was working for Tier Fund, a development agency, and I went to work in Washington, worked with an organization called Sojourners, and that was a community organization that came out in the 1970s, just off the back of the civil rights movement. And then when I came back to Bristol, I worked at the BBC, but being a journalist for me was about trying to get the voice of the voiceless and all that. And then I worked in the voluntary sector again, and I worked in mental health for the National Health Service. And in all of that, I just saw the importance of, we were investing in strengthening communities and the importance of stronger communities. Poverty costs us money. And in many ways, you could just sum it up, friendly people are worth a lot of money to your local economy. Friendly people save your social services and your social interventions lots of money if we can get them.
I think we're going to be quoting you on that, Marvin, if we may. Friendly people save you money. And it's a very, very good point. Now, I want to move on to the conversation about levelling up, which is obviously a bit of a debate that's now sort of emerging in the country. And I suppose the question is, when you think about technology and we think about connected places with the physical, social, environmental connections, what does levelling up mean in this regard? And how can we use this idea to tackle these much more persistent and underlying challenges that you've spoken eloquently about, like entrenched poverty and inequality? Does levelling up offer an insight or a way into this?
I would say, as with many things, it could, if we're clear on what it actually means.
Right.
So for me, levelling up should be about tackling inequality. Right? I'm not sure I got my head around what other people mean by it, but for me, levelling up is an attempt to tackle inequality in an aspirational way. And I like that. I'm aspirational, and I'm aspirational for people around me. I'm aspirational for the city, so I like that. But I have a couple of concerns about levelling up, and that is one, that it needs to be data-led in terms of and evidence-led. How we choose to approach the issue of tackling inequality, having a more successful country, releasing all that untapped talent that's lost because it's born into poverty, needs to be not what you might call wet finger politics, where you wet a finger, stick it in the air, see which way the political wind is blowing and follow it. It needs to follow evidence of where you're going to get the best return. And that doesn't just mean big global numbers. You get a good return by supporting marginalized people. My other concern is that leveling up is geographically dominated and doesn't take account of specific people groups who are left behind irrespective of where they live. If leveling up is only about geography, and our geography is massively important, there has been a north-south divide. That's just the way it's been. So there has to be an element of geography. But unless you take account of specific people groups that have been left behind, one is you will leave huge swathes of inequality in the south of the country, undealt, on the shelf in places like London, Bristol, Plymouth, rural poverty across Cornwall and so forth. That will be a major problem. But actually also up north, you may, raise the tide, as it were, but you won't lift all boats, because there'll be some people, because they're in people groups, who get left behind irrespective of where they are, that won't benefit from the economic growth. You're basically banking on trickle down up north. So I want to just see a real commitment to looking at those specific people groups threaded through any leveling up agenda. And obviously, as I said at the beginning, a real clear, transparent criteria for how investment and grant making decisions are made.
It's a very interesting point, Marvin, that you could have a version of leveling up that simply makes some places in the north more wealthy or some communities more wealthy, but then they replicate the inequality that we've got in the south of the country at the same time. So it's a very, very interesting point that leveling up is about tackling exclusion and inequality. It's not just about regional imbalances, as it were. Very, very helpful. Marvin, I've got my last question now, and then we're going to bring our audience in. You and I first met, I think, in Singapore, which is an interesting place to meet. And Bristol is a very, very globally minded city. There's lots of people in Bristol who've got a global perspective for one reason or another. And you're also a particularly well-connected global civic leader. So I'm interested to know what you feel that you've learned from your counterparts, the other city leaders that you're in contact with around the world, when it comes to this issue of connecting people and place and planet. What have you learned that's inspired you?
Well, when I was elected, I suppose if I was to label myself, I'd be an internationalist. I say repeatedly, I'm of mixed heritage. I'm a global citizen. I've got family that are Jamaicans, right? That's Jamaicans who live in America. I got family in Jamaica. My wife is American. My sister married a Swiss guy who lives in Zurich. We are international. So I'm an internationalist in many ways. But I didn't expect the level of international engagement to be as high as it has been for me as mayor of Bristol. And in fact, what I've learned from the mayors as I've engaged is just how natural this is to city leadership now. It's a logical extension of the argument around devolution. So as mayors have argued for the powers and resources to be able to pull the levers inside their city boundaries to get outcomes, what they've bumped into is the fact that you cannot rest simply by controlling what's in your city boundaries. You have to have the platform to shape the national and international context in which you operate. We got consequences from Brexit. We have consequences from migration, international economy, climate policy. These are all things that impact life in Bristol. And if we're going to work for the good of Bristol, we have to be able to operate internationally. So I guess one of the first people I met really had an impact on me on that was Ben Barber, who wrote, When Mayors Rule the World. Robert Mugger, who I met through Ben and Global Parliament and Mayors as well. Steve Benjamin, who was president of the US Conference of Mayors. All these mayors I've talked to over the time who have really supported this journey that I've been on, which is very local. Let's get houses built for people, to saying we must build houses, but we also need to influence the world in which we are living. And we need to cooperate with other mayors to influence that national and international context.
Brilliant answer, Marvin. And, there's so many people out there who are articulating some of this, but I think you've captured brilliantly this issue that city leaders not only need to be able to manage their city, but they need to be able to change the environment in which the city operates. And I think you've been telling us that in various ways over the past months, and you've said it again very clearly today. So I'm grateful for that. Marvin, we've got quite a few questions from our proactive audience here, and I'm going to just go through a few of them, if I may, with you. The first one concerns housing, where we've got a question that says, with the built environment making up 40% of our carbon emissions, and with the UK housing crisis as well as a climate crisis, what is the role of Bristol in delivering net zero housing, both new and retrofit? So how important is that in your agenda, and what are you doing?
Oh, it's of huge significance. I was actually on a scheme with Boklok, which is a partnership between Skanska and IKEA, and they've reduced the carbon footprint. We were just talking to them about they've reduced the carbon footprint of the housing they're delivering us by 50%. And it's not just in the housing, it's the way it's delivered, the carbon price of delivery of materials and management, and all that. And we also had the conversation with them about the sustainable development goals. So we as a city have made it clear, and through our One City plan, that we are committed to delivering the SDGs. And we want businesses that want to come and work here to show us how they'll deliver the SDGs. Now, I can't force them to, not in every circumstance, but we're making it clear that that's what we're about, and cities and businesses begin to line themselves up against the SDGs. But then we do bump into a challenge. So we want to decarbonize our housing stock as soon as we can. That means retrofitting old homes and decarbonizing new homes. But then we face a dilemma because we still have a housing crisis, and this is where the world gets messy. So what do we do? Do we say to someone, well, we'll take 10% affordable housing on that scheme rather than 25% if you make the houses zero carbon because they cost more to build? But we still have a housing crisis. We have 13,000 people that need homes, and that's where I begin to talk about a just transition. These are real dilemmas for us. Do we go for the houses that are less efficient but provide us with more affordable housing for the many people that are struggling to have a home? By the way, when we have 1,000 families in temporary accommodation living in bed and breakfast, many with their children. So the gap comes back to the point we made at the beginning, Greg, about finance. Line up the money. Right? And I've said to some of the big philanthropists, I won't embarrass anyone, but there are some major wealth holders in the world. We know their names. I don't want to be too simplistic, but surely we could get a group of billionaires in a room that say they want to do good things with their money, with 250 mayors that want to develop their cities and meet their population's needs without destroying the planet. Let's make the match. Come up with the vehicles that help make that connection. Make it affordable for us to deliver zero carbon homes. So that we can make sure that we're still housing our populations.
Yeah. There's again a very important point that you're making here, that we know that in the long term, zero carbon homes pay for themselves, but in the short term, they add a cost to the construction process. So it's not that there's something wrong and that you should be placed in impossible dilemmas. It's rather that we need financial tools that capture the value that's created later so that we can accelerate the investment now. And I know that's what we're going to be looking at with our City Climate Investment Commission.
Boklok made this very point when we sat with them last week looking at their scheme. They can, say, put solar panels on the roof, but then they find it hard to increase the price of the house if they were to do so, because people say, well, that costs more. But actually, people got reduced energy bills every year. So it actually pays itself off. But actually, the vehicles and the mentality around housing at the moment doesn't capture that. And that's some of the change that we need to see.
Well, that's where we need to focus. And I'm glad we're going to be working on this together, which will be good. There's another question here, Marvin, that's been put in the Q&A, which is about the voice of the marginalized. And our audience member says, that there's a risk here that it's the people who are furthest away from the workplace and have the least digital connectivity who are likely to suffer most from some of the transitions that are now going on. What do we do for the most marginalized in terms of promoting their quality of life and the quality of services available for them as the world moves into this more hybrid, digitized way of working?
Well, if I can be a bit sober about it, to be perfectly frank, I think that's inevitable. I think what will happen, I think the poorest and most marginalized will pay the highest price ultimately. But that's what the political contest is about, isn't it? What I want my political contest to be about, in part, in making sure that we minimize that injustice that will be stitched in. But what we do, this comes back to the point I've made, a number of times, and we've tried to capture in the Bristol, and in not a perfect way, but we're trying, in having the plan. The more we can plan, the more we can anticipate negative outcomes and plan to deal with them before they happen. So we know there's going to be a big program of retrofitting homes. We know there's going to be a big house building program. Well, let's link up with the City of Bristol College today and our universities and train people for those jobs we know will be there, right? And actually, come on this course, there's a guaranteed job at the end of it. There is some hope for you. And hope was big during Obama's campaign, but let's not underestimate the importance of hope to our politics right now. We've seen politicians preying on hopelessness over the last few years, and the consequences of people like that succeeding are dire, both in terms of climate and social disintegration. So that, again, matching the plan to finance, I think, is one of the best tools we can have to secure as just a transition as possible.
Marvin, thank you very much. And of course, this point needs to be made and made and made again. So we totally support the approach you're taking there. I'm going to ask one last question, if I may, Marvin, and then we're going to say thank you very much and goodbye. And it's really about Bristol and its innovative capability. As we visit cities around the world, Bristol is one that shines out as a place that can make change happen. And I'm interested to know what you think Bristol should become famous for in terms of your civic innovations, the changes that you're making. How do you hope Bristol will be perceived by city leaders around the world in terms of what is Bristol going to become famous for being really good at in the spaces we've been talking about?
Oh, gosh. I got a list.
Go on.
I would like... So if this is somewhat aspirational, not necessarily, many of these things, I don't have an easy, there aren't easy answers to them. I would like Bristol to be the city that unlocks social mobility, that breaks the link or breaks the prison, as it were. That means that the circumstances into which you're born are the biggest indicator of where you end up in life. I want that link broken. I think it's the ultimate injustice. And I think, too, it robs the country of trillions of dollars worth of talent, right? Because talent's born into poverty and potential's born into poverty. That's not sustainable in a global war for talent. So that's quite an abstract one. I would like Bristol to be the city in which no child is poor, and one of my measures for that is no child is hungry. We have about 20% of our children in the city who wake up at risk of hunger every day. We've had a major mobilization, and I would say in the name of our one city approach, it's been us, but we've been one partner among many. Our business community, our voluntary sector, our faith groups have mobilized in Bristol and actually built a system of food collection and distribution that gets it out. So it was mobilized incredibly well during COVID, and I've been blown away. So if I talk about social mobility and poverty as measured by hunger and nutritional poverty, tackling those two, I would love Bristol to be known for those two. I'm going to put climate, tackling ecology as givens. We're going on those. But those are two of my fundamental measures.
Marvin, thank you very much. So we've heard that with Bristol, it's a one city approach. You're bringing together so many of the different leaders, the communities, the institutions, the systems operators in the city, one plan, one common vision. And then this idea of becoming the city that is recognized as the city that has unlocked social mobility for a large number of people, a city that's developed a just transition where ecology and climate have been put together with jobs, quality of life, public services, and a city where no child is poor or hungry and is able, therefore, to fulfill their potential. Marvin Rees, Mayor of Bristol, Thank you so much for speaking to us today. It's been a great honour to spend some time with you.
Thank you very much for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.